Hey everybody, mel0n here. Welcome back to another episode of the mel0n Review. Today we're going to be wrapping up part 2 of my review of the Endgame Gear OP1 8K. Now this was a really cool mouse to review for a variety of reasons. It was probably the easiest mouse I've ever had to review on the channel because I'll be completely honest with you, there was not a lot to criticize in this mouse. This mouse is probably the most complete package mouse I think I've ever seen. So this mouse was a very easy mouse to review as a whole, which is a really nice change of pace from things I've previously seen. And the OP1 8K is easily one of the best mice I've used in a very long time. So there's a lot to talk about this mouse in terms of what Endgame Gear did right and why this mouse is so good. Now before we get into it, I did want to say a big thank you to Endgame Gear for sending over the OP1 8K for review. I greatly appreciate it. As always, with everything you see here on the channel, you always get the truth and an unbiased take about everything you see here on the channel, regardless of a free or discounted unit. And as always, timestamps will be available in the video description. So let's start this video off by talking about how the OP1 8K performed in game, and then we'll dive into the other really cool aspects of this mouse. All right, now in terms of in-game performance, to be completely honest with you, the OP1 8K just performed in a league of its own. The OP1 8K is the only mouse I have tried ever since I reviewed the Death Adder V3 wired edition that has come close to beating that mouse in its #1 spot for me, because again, I like wired mice. I just find they feel better than wireless mice, and the exact same situations here with the OP1 8K, where this mouse just has so much raw performance packed into this tiny little shell that it just beat every single wireless mouse I have tried in the past year or so. There is no wireless mouse that comes anywhere close to the performance I felt here on the OP1 8K. The only mouse that kind of matched the performance profile is the Death Adder V3 wired edition and the HyperX Pulsefire Haze 2. Those are the only two mice in my collection that came anywhere close to matching the performance here on the OP1 8K. And you could even make an argument that the OP1 8K is better than those two wired mice I just mentioned, because as custom switches, has a better sensor implementation across the board, regardless of what game I was playing, Valorant, Overwatch, Bad Business, whatever it was. This mouse just felt so good. It literally felt like I was cheating a lot of the time just because it was so responsive. In the past month or so of me testing the OP1 8K, I've gotten more aces in Valorant than I think I've gotten in like the past year, which is kind of insane to think about, but there is just something incredibly special about this mouse that just makes it perform exceptionally well. Now, I know there's going to be people in my comments yapping away saying, oh, it's a wired mouse in 2024, wireless is the same tech. Complete cope, wired mice are always going to be superior. I don't care if on paper they're the same. Wired mice feel better, especially when it comes to sensor implementations, and especially when it comes to high polling rate implementations like 4 and 8K polling. And across the board, as I mentioned before, the OP1 8K just blew everything else out of the water. There is not a single wireless mouse that I've tried in the past year that has come anywhere close to this mouse. This mouse is in a league of its own in terms of performance, and it is just an exceptionally good performing mouse. Now, one of the reasons why the OP1 8K performs so well, aside from its sensor implementation and its high polling rate, is the shape. So let's talk about that next. Alrighty, now in terms of shape, the OP1 8K's shape is a right-handed symmetrical mouse. Technically speaking, you could use this as an ambi mouse because it is the same on both sides, but there are no side buttons on the right side of the mouse. So if you do use this mouse with a left hand, you will not get side buttons. But there's one really cool thing that Endgame Gear has done here that I haven't seen on any other symmetrical mice. There's actually a setting inside the software to swap the mouse to be used as a left-handed mouse, which is a really cool thing to see, so you don't have to manually configure your buttons. It will just do it by itself. Now, the shape is a claw grip optimized shape. It's similar to the X2 V2 and the Sora V2, but it's thinner on the sides and has a slightly more pronounced hump on the back. In terms of dimensions, it is 118.2 millimeters long, it is 60.5 millimeters wide, and it is 37.2 millimeters high. Now, similar to the Sora V2, the sides of the mouse are inwardly tilted. It's not nearly as aggressive as we saw on the Zowie U2, but it's like around the same level of tilt as I say on the Sora V2, which does help the overall gripability of the mouse. Now, the hump design of the OP1 8K is the fairly standard short wide hump. However, it is a lot thinner than a lot of the other humps we've seen on similar claw grip optimized mice. I would say it's closer to the Sora V2 than it is on the X2 V2, but it does feel very good. Again, very optimized for claw grip regardless. It's still very comfortable, just a little thinner than we've seen on other mice. Now, in terms of compatible grip styles and contact areas, since this is a claw grip optimized mouse, of course, claw grip is going to be the primary use case for this mouse. However, this mouse does kind of fall into the same area where the Sora V2 felt, where it does differ depending on your hand size. Now, for smaller hands, this is definitely going to be optimized best for palm or claw grips. For medium hands, it's going to be good for every grip style, so it's going to be good for palm, claw, and fingertip. And for large hands, it's going to be a very aggro claw or maybe slightly relaxed claw depending on your hand size and fingertip grip. Now, I will say the mouse is definitely best suited for medium hands across the board. For my 7.5 inch by 5 inch hands, I can get away with an aggro claw on the OP1 8K, but it is just ever so slightly too short. So I did end up doing a lot of fingertip testing on this mouse, similar to the Sora V2. Now, of course, since there is about a 10-gram weight difference between the Sora V2 and the OP1 8K, the OP1 8K wasn't as good for fingertip grip as the Sora V2 was, but that's just because the Sora V2 was so much lighter, but it is still a good shape overall. I do wish it was a little bigger. I would love to see like a larger version of the OP1 8K in the future from Endgame Gear, but again, my hand size is not very normal, so I'm not really an optimized use case, but across the board, unless you have extremely large hands, this is going to be a very, very comfortable mouse for pretty much every hand size. All right, now in terms of contact areas, for my 7.5 inch by 5 inch hands doing an aggro claw here on the OP1AK, it does make a lot of fairly balanced contact between my thenar, hypothenar, and mid palm. I will say for smaller hands, not as big as mine of course, there will be a lot more emphasis on mid palm contact, but it will still have a lot of contact in the thenar or hypothenar. Just mid palm contact is going to be the primary contact point for this mouse for pretty much every hand size due to that kind of standard hump design we've seen, but it's a little thinner on the sides, which does give a lot more emphasis to mid palm contact. But across the board, the contact areas are going to be very compatible with claw grip as advertised for this mouse, so it's going to feel pretty comfortable for pretty much every hand size with the exception of very large hands like mine here. All right, now in terms of the shell design itself, the shell is plastic and has a coating applied to the entire shell including the main buttons, but the coating is not applied to the side buttons, which I thought was kind of odd. I confirmed with Endgame Gear that the coating on the white and the black versions is exactly the same. Now the coating is this semi-matte coating. It is very, very grippy. It's very reminiscent of the Zowie coating, but a lot better in my opinion. I find it just overall performed better. Where the Zowie's coating got a little slippery with moisture, this coating stays very, very grippy. Unfortunately though, due to its similarity to the Zowie coating, it does have the exact same problem as the Zowie coating where this mouse will constantly pick up moisture and oils and dust and that kind of stuff during use. So on my black version, I did find my mouse looked dirty a lot of the time, especially when I was using it. I ended up having to wipe it off pretty much constantly just because I'm a little picky about keeping it clean. If you're someone who's a little picky about that, I'd recommend getting the white version over the black version because you're going to get the same performance in the white coating, but all the grime and that kind of stuff isn't going to be as noticeable as it is on the black version. Now I did want to briefly mention here the grip tapes that are included. Now oddly enough, there are only side grips here on the OP1AK. There are no click covers, which I thought was a little odd. The grip tape does perform well. For stock grip tape, it's actually pretty good. It's not as good as the grip tape we saw on the Wiseowl Cloud. That is still like the best grip tape I saw, and it's still not as good as aftermarket grips like the X-Ray Pad Cicada Wing or Gecko Grips 2.0, but they're still pretty solid for included grips. The coating is so good, you don't even really need to use the grip tape, and again, despite my very sweaty hands, I didn't need the grip tape at all. So while it's nice to see it included, it's not really necessary for most people, and again, if you are going to use it, it would have been nice to see click covers in the box, but again, that is a very, very minimal thing. Alrighty, now in terms of build quality and QC, the build quality in this mouse is actually exceptional. There is no creaking, flexing anywhere in this entire unit. The shell is very rigid as well. Very, very well built. Honestly, I think this is one of the only mice that kind of challenges Vaxi for their build quality because this mouse is built like an absolute tank, which is great to see. Now, of course, keep in mind my sample was sent up by Endgame Gear, but across the board, I haven't heard of any QC issues or any kind of build quality issues from anyone else who has an OP1AK. Overall, it is just a very well built and very well QC'd mouse. Alrighty, now the weight of the OP1AK is coming in at around 50.5 grams. Now, my unit weighs in at 50.3 grams, but I am using the stock speed skates here. With the extra set of control skates, it's probably going to be more around the 50.5 gram range. Now, this is actually a breath of fresh air because commonly what we see is we see a mouse advertised at like 55 grams, and then in the fine print it says plus minus 2 grams. The OP1AK though is completely different from that. It is actually below the advertised weight or matching the advertised weight depending on what skates you put on it, which is a really, really nice thing to see. There's no plus minus 2 gram nonsense here. So that is really great to see. And again, the 50.5 gram range or 50.3 gram range is very solid for a mouse of this kind. You can, of course, make this mouse a lot lighter by doing a bunch of modding work to this one. There is actually a lot of areas where you can cut some weight on this mouse. But again, for my personal take, 50.5 grams is completely usable, and I'm very happy with the weight here on the OP1AK. Alrighty, let's talk about the main clicks next. Now, the main click buttons are these ever so slightly convex main buttons. They don't have an indentation running through them, so they are slightly rounded, but because the coating on the mouse is so good, your hands stay anchored, so makes sense why they don't have any kind of indentation in them. It is using the same coating as the rest of the shell, which is great to see. I'll give you a little sound test here. Now, the switch type here is a custom Kale GX switch that was made in collaboration with Kale and Endgame Gear. Now, the switch is very light, very snappy, good spammability. It reminds me a lot of the clicks on the HyperX Pulsefire Haze 2, but those were using HyperX's custom switches, which I'm pretty sure are a TTC of some variety, but I don't know for sure. The main buttons have basically no pre-travel and a very, very slight amount of post-travel. The buttons are very well stabilized, and there's basically no play on either side of the main buttons. Overall, just the click implementation is extremely solid. They feel really, really good, and these collaboration switches between Endgame Gear and Kale feel really, really solid. Now, one thing I did want to highlight about this mouse is that this mouse does have hot-swappable switches, so you can change the way your clicks feel by using different switches, which is a really nice attention to detail. I'm going to do my best to try and get my hands on those switch packs to do some testing on those as well, but that'll be a video for the future, so be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that. Now, one other really cool thing that Endgame Gear has done here with the main clicks, as I mentioned before, this is a collaboration between Endgame Gear and Kale, is that these custom GX switches actually have a really cool way to make the clicks faster. So in a traditional switch, you have a hammer that's inside your switch, and whenever that hammer makes makes contact with the bottom contact of the mouse, that registers a click. Now you can actually change these KLGX switches to instead register that the moment where the top contact becomes loose, it registers the click when the top contact is released, not when the hammer hits the bottom contact. Now, of course, you can make the switches just operate like a normal switch where the hammer contact hitting the bottom causes the click, but this is a really cool thing to increase the speed. Now, of course, this does have some potential downsides in terms of double clicking and that kind of stuff, but Endgame Gear has done a really good job of preventing that. So I haven't had any issues with the speed mode on these clicks or any issues with implementation. They just feel like a faster click, which is a really, really cool feature. In terms of like how much of a difference it actually makes, I can't really give you empirical data for that because I don't have an LDAT to actually test the click latency, but I wanted to mention this is a very unique feature I don't think I've ever seen before, and this is a really, really cool custom feature here on the OP1 AK to make this mouse perform even better than it already did. All right, now in terms of the side buttons are a bit of a unique design. They're kind of half flat, half triangular buttons. The buttons don't have the same coating as the rest of the shell, which is a little disappointing. They do appear to be raw plastic, but that said though, despite them not having the same coating as the rest of the shell, they are actually still pretty grippy, which is nice to see. I would prefer the buttons to be flat and have the same coating as the rest of the mouse, but they're a lot better than other side buttons we've seen with no coating on them before. They're still very usable. So while they're not sharing the same coating and they're not flat, they're still completely usable in my opinion. I'll give you a little sound test here. Now, in terms of the switch type, the OP1AK is using KLGM 2.0s for these side buttons here. Now, I will say the actuation weight on the side buttons is a little heavier than the main clicks. I probably put around a medium actuation weight. They're not as spammable, but they still do feel really snappy. They do have a really good rebound to them. They're just a little heavier to click than the main clicks. I would like to see maybe a little bit of a lighter implementation for the side button because it can be kind of jarring sometimes. It's a little harder to click, but it's a fairly minimal problem. I will say that the side buttons do have essentially no pre-travel and very, very little post-travel, which is great to see. They are very well stabilized and very well anchored, so there's no play on the buttons. Overall, the implementation is good. Again, I would like to see flat side buttons with the same coating as the rest of the shell and maybe a little lighter in terms of shell actuation, but that's a very minimal complaint. The side button implementation is still much better than the traditional one we see on a lot of other mice. All right, now in terms of the scroll wheel, the encoder is a TTC silver encoder, and I will say it's about a medium scroll force with very, very pronounced scroll points. You can't really like free scroll at all. It's very, very determined in its scroll points. I will say it does have a bit higher audio feedback from the encoder than we've seen on other mice that I've covered recently. It's not nearly as bad as the Vaxi or Zowie mice with their old meat grinder scroll wheels, but it still definitely has a little bit more audio feedback than you commonly see, but that's a very minimal thing. The scroll wheel click is a KLGM 2.0 switch, and it's going to feel pretty much one for one with the side buttons, which means it's going to have the same kind of downsides where it's a little too high to actuate and it kind of has a weak rebound. Again, I would like to see maybe a different switch or a lighter actuation weight for the scroll wheel click. I don't really use it that much, but for people who do use it, it may be a little jarring to actually click it down. Maybe moving it to more of a light actuation like I would like to see with the side buttons would be nice to see, but again, I'm very much splitting hairs here. It's a pretty solid implementation overall, just maybe a little on the heavier side. All right, next up, let's talk about the sensor and MCU. Now, the OP1AK is using the PA3395 DMT6QU for the main sensor. This is the non-lockdown version, so it does have a max DPI of 2600. It does have all the sensor options, including angle snapping, ripple, and motion sync enabled on it by default. Now, the OP1AK is using a rather unique MCU. It's not using the traditional Nordic 52840 we commonly see. It's actually using a Nuvoton M483. Now, we've actually seen this MCU before on the channel, but it's been a very long time since I talked about it. This is the same MCU that was in the HyperX Pulsar Haze 2. Now, this is actually a good thing because the HyperX Pulsar Haze 2 actually really surprised me with how well that mouse performed. It had a really, really solid 8K polling rate implementation. The high polling rate implementation here on the OP1AK is very, very solid. I would say probably the same, if not a little better than it was in the HyperX Pulsar Haze 2 because it's using a PixArt sensor instead of the custom HyperX sensor we saw on that mouse, but the implementation is very solid. I had no problems with any of the polling rate ranges on my system. It just performed very well across the board. And again, while it's not the most traditional MCU, it still has a really great implementation, which is great to see. Now, of course, since this is a wired mouse, the wire is going to make or break the usage of this mouse. And thankfully, Endgame Gear has done a really, really good job with the cable implementation. So it is a 5.9 foot cable. It is a paracord cable. It has good flexibility, good rigidity. It is compatible with both a standard desk bungee and Pulsar ES bungee. Overall, the cable implementation is very solid, and the really nice attention to detail where the cable is kind of bent up at the front of the mouse around 20-30 degrees is a really, really nice thing to see because that just completely negates any chance of cable drag when using it with a bungee. Overall, the cable implementation is perfect. Really no complaints here for me at all. Alrighty, I also wanted to talk about the software here for the OP1AK. Now, the software is a pretty bare bones software. It's not the most aesthetically pleasing software like we've seen from other mice, but it does do the job. It's just a very lightweight, very simple software, which I actually don't really mind that much. I actually kind of prefer it like this. The software is very easy to navigate. It's very easy to use. Everything's right there on the first few pages for you to do. You can just pulling rate, DPI, you can change the speed mode for the switches on and off. Pretty much anything you want to do, you can just do it right in the software within a couple seconds, which is great to see. Unlike a lot of the other 8K mice we've seen released, this mouse actually defaults to 8K out of the box instead of 1K, and you have to manually turn it up to 8K. This one just comes with 8K out of the box. The reason I'm mentioning this is because, again, commonly you have to adjust it yourself up to the higher pulling rate. If you just plug in the OP1 8K and you're having performance problems or any kind of frame drops and that kind of stuff, it's most likely because of the 8K pulling rate. So if you do have any issues using it, I'd recommend dropping it down to 4 or 2K to whatever matches your system performance the best. I didn't have any problems with the 8K on my system aside from like the occasional frame drop, but just note that it does come with 8K by default. So if you do have performance problems, just adjust that down to 4 or 2 or 1K. Now, lastly, I wanted to talk about repairability. Now, repairability is definitely something I'm a bit of a stickler for because I call out companies for having bad repairability pretty much every single time I review a mouse, but this is a very nice change of pace where this mouse is actually the most repairable mouse I think I've ever seen. And again, as I mentioned in my unboxing video, including a screwdriver in with your packaging just speaks to the repairability and the serviceability of your mouse, which is great to see. Opening this unit up is extremely easy, very easy to swap out the switches, very easy to do any kind of repairs or cleaning on the inside of the mouse. Just overall, it is a very, very repairable mouse. Now, unfortunately, despite the high degree of repairability here on the OP1 8K, they don't really sell replacement parts with the exception of the switches, which I mean is nice, but it would be nice to see Endgame Gear sell new shells, new clicks, like just new parts for the mouse, new cables and that kind of stuff. It's kind of contradictory to the nature of this mouse not to have an option for user to buy parts for the unit. Again, especially because this mouse is such an end game optimized mouse, pardon the pun with their name, but this is a mouse I can see people maining for like the next 4 or 5 years. The lack of extra parts aside from the switches is a little disappointing to see. So hopefully they'll change that and have some kind of market for replacement parts in the near future. Alrighty, well, in closing, the OP1 8K is, in all honesty, probably one of the best mice I've used ever. Again, there are only 2 mice that come even remotely close to this mouse in terms of their performance, and that is the Death Adder V3 Wired and the HyperX Pulsefire Haze 2. However, both of those mice do not have the same repairability and hot-swappable switches as the OP1 8K, and the raw performance you get on this mouse is arguably better than those 2 mice. And as I mentioned before when I talked about in-game performance, the OP1 8K just blew every single wireless mice I have out of the water. This mouse just performed so damn well. And the only real downsides I have with this mouse is that the shell shape is just a little too small for my hand size. I would love to see Endgame Gear maybe make a larger one in the future. Aside from that, the lack of click covers and only having side grips is a little odd. The side buttons and the scroll wheel click having a little bit too high actuation was a little odd, and the lack of actual replacement parts aside from the main switches is disappointing given the serviceability of this mouse. But aside from those fairly minor nitpicks, this is easily the best mouse I've covered in a very, very long time. This is going to be like a no-brainer recommendation for me because, again, high degree of repairability, which is great to see, extremely easy to service, amazing performance. Yeah, it's wired, but as I mentioned before, wired really doesn't matter, and this mouse blew every single wireless mouse I have out of the water. It is just across the board an amazing mouse. Endgame Gear has cooked with this thing like crazy. I'm honestly really impressed. But that is going to be everything for this episode of the mel0n review. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like in the video, and if you want to see more videos like this, or you want to see my teardown of the OP1 8K showing you how to service this mouse yourself and going through all the repairability stuff on this mouse, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss that video coming out in a couple days after this one. Thank you very much again to Endgame Gear, who has kind of sent out the OP1 8K for review. I greatly appreciate it. If you'd like to support the channel, everything I'm doing here with the reviews and the teardown project, you can become a member here on YouTube. That's the best way to directly support the channel, or you can support the channel using the affiliate codes I have linked down in the video description. But that is everything for today. Thank you very much for watching my review of the Endgame Gear OP1 8K, and I will catch you guys in the teardown of the OP1 8K coming out in a couple days. Peace.